At 11:47 a.m. on November 29, 1943, the tail of Ricky Ticky Tavi stopped being part of a B-17 and became its own falling world. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran didn't even hear the flak shell that did it. 1 second, the 19-year-old tail gunner was hunched in his cramped bubble at the very back of the flying fortress, feet on the stirrups, hands on the twin 50s, the horizon steady in his sight. The next, there was a white flash and a concussion that felt like someone had hit the aircraft with a giant hammer. The noise went beyond loud. It was like being inside a bell when it rang. The tail section lurched. The sound of the 4 right cyclones driving Ricky Ticky Tavi through the thin air at 20,000 feet vanished. So did the familiar vibration of the fuselage stretching forward to the nose, where 8 of his 9 crewmates should have been. Suddenly, there was only wind, howling, ravenous wind, punching through broken skin and torn aluminum. The entire tail assembly, vertical fin, horizontal stabilizers, and the little metal cocoon of Moran's tail position had been severed cleanly from the rest of the aircraft. He felt it in his harness, the weird, weightless float as the tail lost the support of the forward fuselage, then the stomach and throat lurch as gravity grabbed hold. He was falling, 4 miles of sky below him. For a single chaotic heartbeat, everything was tumbling, the world flipping end over end, torn cables whipping in the air, spent brass casings and shards of plexiglass bouncing around his boots like thrown coins. Then momentum and aerodynamics made a deal. The heavy tail section yawed, pitched, and finally settled into a grotesquely stable, nose-down attitude, vertical fin above, jagged backbone below, twin 50s in the tail pointing back up the way they'd come. Moran's body tried to slam forward out of the turret. His harness bit into his shoulders and hips, yanking him to a stop. His head snapped forward, helmet cracking against the armor plate. Stars exploded in his vision, but the black disk of the gun sight remained, floating, sane, in the madness. He blinked hard. The world outside the tail gunner's tiny window was all wrong now. No fuselage, no wing, just open sky above, and impossibly far below, a smear of gray-green land coming up way too fast. His left hand, acting on sheer training, groped for the parachute pack he'd shoved behind his seat. The canvas was in place. The silk inside was not. It was shredded, riddled with neat, round bullet holes, and ragged tears from shrapnel. Harness straps were half severed, ends hanging loose like frayed rope. Useless. For a second, the knowledge was like ice water dumped into his veins. No chute, no airplane, no way out. Then the war punched back in. A shadow flashed across his tiny slice of sky. A dark cross with wings, curving in. A German fighter, FW-190, radial nose and square wingtips, was still making a pass at what his pilot thought was a crippled B-17 tail about to fall out of the fight. Maybe he wanted to be sure. Maybe he'd seen too many stories of dead fortresses clawing their way home. To him, the tail gunner was just another statistic to finish. To Moran, that 190 was suddenly the only thing in the world he could do anything about. His thumbs found the butterfly triggers. He squeezed. Miraculously, the guns responded. The tail turret still had power, maybe from residual battery, maybe from lines that hadn't been severed yet. The twin Brownings hammered, their staccato roar swallowed by the slipstream. Empty brass cascaded around his boots as the falling tail spewed 50 caliber tracers back up into the sky it had just been torn out of. Moran tracked the 190 as best he could, fighting the bizarre, bobbing, plunging motion of his upside-down world. The German pilot, diving in for what he thought would be an easy kill, had no reason yet to imagine his target was not only still occupied, but still deadly. For a few long seconds, a 19-year-old kid in a falling coffin and a veteran Luftwaffe fighter ace danced a gun duel at 20,000 feet, one man falling, the other diving, both trying to kill each other before gravity or flak or fate finished the job.
Eugene Moran was due.
Owing to hit the ground soon, one way or another. Until then, he still had guns. And while he had guns, he wasn't done fighting. 4 hours earlier, Moran had been standing on English concrete, stamping his feet against the cold. RAF Snetterton Heath, Norfolk. Tarp-covered Nissen huts. Mud. The smell of coffee and exhaust. 19 years old, barely 4 months out of gunnery school, he looked younger than that with his helmet off, freckles, still a hint of baby fat around the jaw. The Army Air Forces had taught him to shoot, to patch up radios, to identify enemy fighters in silhouette. They hadn't taught him how to feel like a man when he stepped into a crew of veterans. The 96th Bomb Group had been in it since '42. Its B-17s had names like Ricky Ticky Tavi, Joker's Wild, Hellzapoppin'. Their crews had the 1,000-yard stare and the kind of tired that didn't go away with sleep. In the last 2 months alone, Bremen's Flak and fighters had destroyed 64 bombers. Moran's squadron had lost 11 tail gunners since September. He knew the numbers. Everyone did. "Chute harness tight, Sarge?" the waist gunner had asked that morning as they walked out to the revetment, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," Moran answered, tugging the straps. "Wouldn't want my ass to fall out of the sky." They laughed. That's what you did. The B-17F Ricky Ticky Tavi sat squat and purposeful, 4 engines ticking as ground crew pulled the props through and made last checks. Nose art of a cartoon mongoose with a Tommy gun grinned under the bombardier's window. They climbed aboard in order, pilot and co-pilot up front, flight engineer top turret, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, waist gunners, ball turret, tail. The tail gunner's route was the worst. He crawled through the bomb bay on a narrow catwalk, past the metal racks that would soon carry tons of ordnance, through the radio room, through the waist, where 50s on pintle mounts pointed out of open windows, then into the narrowing tube of the rear fuselage, past control, cables that hummed faintly when someone moved a yoke up front. Back here, 40 feet from the pilot, the war was a different thing. The tail position was a stubby cone of plexiglass and metal at the very back, a tiny bubble cradling a rotating frame and 2 heavy Browning M2s. You backed in, strapped yourself down, slid your feet into the stirrups, and suddenly you were alone in your own little world. No one could reach you quickly. No one could tap your shoulder and say bail out or hang on. If something came for you in the tail, you faced it by yourself. That suited some men. Others found it unnerving. Moran had drawn the short straw, literally according to legend, on tail duty. But there was pride in it too. "The tail sees everything first," his gunnery instructor had said at Wendover. "Your job is to warn the crew, to kill anything that tries to slip in the back door, and to be the last son of a bitch firing if it all goes to hell." He'd believed it. In practice, the first 4 missions had been a mix of boredom and terror. Long stretches of nothing but contrails and cold toes, punctuated by sudden seconds of chaos. The black flower of a flak burst too close, a streaking dot resolving into a 109 or a 190. He'd fired his guns in anger 3 times. Maybe he'd hit something, maybe not. In the chaos of a raid, it was hard to tell. Claims went to whoever had gun camera film or solid confirmation. What he knew for sure was the attrition. Empty bunks in the hut, mess tables with fewer faces, the quiet ceremony of flying a man's effects away. In that context, a 5th mission wasn't just another day at work. It was Russian roulette with slightly better odds. The target this time was Bremen again. Industrial yards, shipbuilding slips, flak positions that had already proven they knew their craft. At briefing, the intelligence officer had pointed his swagger stick at the map, described German fighter bases, probable intercept zones, altitudes. 34 6 B-17s will cross the coast at 23,000 feet, he'd said. Expect heavy flak. Expect aggressive fighter opposition from JG groups in the area. A board on the wall listed losses from previous Bremen runs. Red chalk, too many lines. Tail gunners paid particular attention. Their position was both the best and worst place to be in a fortress where fighters were concerned. On the plus side, their field of fire was magnificent. They could sweep the entire 6 o'clock hemisphere from slightly above the horizontal to well below. Anyone trying to creep up behind a B-17 had to think about the tail guns. On the minus side, their armor was thin, and German pilots knew that killing the tail gunner opened up the bomber. Hit the tail, blind the fortress. Moran had buckled in that morning knowing all of that. He'd checked his guns, cycled the chargers, felt the hard fort of the butterfly triggers under his thumbs. He'd slapped the tail interphone switch and said, with a bravado he didn't quite feel, "Tail to crew, ready back here. Let's go annoy some krauts." Someone had laughed. Someone else, a voice he thought was the bombardier's, had said, "You keep 'em honest back there, Gene." Then they'd rolled, rumbled, and lifted into the gray English sky. 4 hours later, over Bremen, almost everyone who'd been on that interphone was dead, and the kid in the tail was about to learn what "last son of a bitch firing" really meant. The run-in had started well enough. Crossing the German coast at 23,000 feet, Ricky Ticky Tavi slotted into position in the bomber stream. Moran's world was contrails and the flash of sunlight off aluminum. To his left and right, B-17s filled his sight. Staggered boxes, 90-degree tailplanes, ball turrets glinting, waist gunners already at their posts. Radio chatter crackled in his ears, gunners calling out bogeys, pilots adjusting formation. The first fighters came in around the time they hit the initial point. "Bandits 6 o'clock high," someone shouted on the command channel. Tail guns and top turrets swung. Moran saw them, single-engine fighters with black crosses slashing in from above and behind. BF-109s, skinny-nosed, with 20mm cannons in the hub. A few FW-190s, bulkier, radial-nosed. A 109 lined up on his box, nose flickering as it spat cannon rounds. White puffs of exploding shells walked toward a fortress 2 elements over, chewing at its port wing. "Not on my watch," Moran muttered, swinging his guns. He squeezed. The twin 50s thundered, the recoil pulsing up his arms. Tracers streaked out, every 5th round a bright dot, the others invisible lumps of lead. He hosed them across the closing fighter's nose, then corrected, walking the line toward the cockpit. The 109 wobbled, a sudden jerk. A thin gray thread of smoke started from its engine cowl. The German hauled back, rolling out of his attack. Moran tracked him, sent a parting burst after him, then snapped his sight to another threat. The tail turret was like that, all reaction and tiny corrections, body and machine moving as one. Then flak. Black bursts bloomed ahead, then among them. Each dark, cotton ball puff was a timed explosion, shells lobbed up by 88s and 105s on the ground. When they went off, they sent shrapnel fragments scything out at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The trick, for German gunners, was to get the time fuses right, so the shells would burst where the bombers were, not 1,000 feet above or below. They were good at their job. Bremen had made sure of that. Moran felt the first near miss as a thud through the airframe, a shiver that ran through stringers and skins. "Flak, 12 high," someone called. He couldn't see the burst directly ahead. His world was behind and below, but he saw the effects. Puffs forming a dark, ragged curtain around the formation. B-17s flinching as pieces of metal punched through wings and fuselages. The interphone crackled, then went silent. "Radio?" he called. No answer. "Pilot? Tail to pilot?" Nothing but static and the ambient roar of the slipstream. Ahead of him, Ricky Ticky Tavi began to drift. It slid slightly back and down relative to the box, an ominous symptom. Maybe an engine hit, maybe controls damaged. German fighters smelled weakness like wolves. They came in again. FW-190s now, some in classic 12 o'clock high attacks, others swinging lazily around to 6 o'clock low under the tailgun's easiest arcs. Moran swiveled, fired, swiveled again, trying to defend a space too big for one man's guns. Cannon fire from a 190 hammered the rear fuselage. He heard rounds tear through the aluminum tube ahead of him, felt the shudder. Then something catastrophic happened forward. A massive flash, hot light even at the back of the plane. A pressure wave punched down the fuselage, the nose section, bombardier, navigator's station, cockpit, disappeared in flame and debris. Moran saw it only in fragments through his side windows. One moment, familiar shape. The next, a ragged spinning cloud of metal, glass, and fire. The pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, gone in an instant. The blast tore through the radio compartment, the waist, killing 3 more men outright. Fire licked along the bomb bay. For a moment, Ricky Ticky Tavi continued on, decapitated, held aloft by momentum and the still-turning engines on her wings. Then she sagged. The bomber dropped out of the formation, sliding down and back. Alone, German fighters swarmed. They sensed crippled prey the way they always did. A fortress unable to keep position was meat. Hit it from angles its remaining guns couldn't cover. Finish it before it fell into cloud and disappeared. Moran did the only thing he had been trained to do. He kept firing. He saw a 190 committing to a rear-quarter attack, wings rocking as the pilot corrected for slipstream buffeting. He lined him up, thumbed the triggers, traced an arc of tracers into the oncoming fighter's path. The German jinked. A shell exploded off to Moran's right, showering his turret with shrapnel. Plexiglass shattered, cold air punching in. He ducked by instinct, feeling tiny cuts open across his face. When he looked back, the 190 was gone. Whether hit or simply broken off, he couldn't tell. He tried the interphone again. Tail to crew. Anyone? A voix ban. Sea crackled, faint and high with panic. The navigator from somewhere just aft of the missing nose. Tail. I'm getting out. Nose is gone. I'm bailing. Godspeed, Moran said automatically, mind numb. He groped behind him for his own chute. His fingers came away with shreds, silk torn to rags, straps half cut. He stared at it for what, in later memory, would be a strangely calm half-second. The realization settled in with awful clarity. No parachute. A crippled B-17. German fighters still in the fight. No one coming to help. If there had been time to pray, he might have. Instead, the flak that had already torn his bomber's nose off reached back and finished the job. The shell that severed the tail hit somewhere near the radio room. There was flash, shock, and then falling. The dive wasn't smooth. Physics doesn't care about human narrative. A heavy tail surface with a jagged forward end doesn't glide. It plummets. The first few seconds after the tail broke off were a tumble of gray and white and streaking black shapes. The horizon flipped end over end. Moran's inner ear lost the thread. Up, down, left, right, meaningless. His harness held him in the turret, but loose gear didn't. Ammo boxes, tools, bits of plexiglass and aluminum whirled around him. One spent brass casing, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, smacked him under the eye, opening a cut that dripped warm blood into the cold air. He vomited, just a little, then swallowed it back down, throat burning under the oxygen mask. Gradually, the tail found its attitude. Aerodynamic forces shoved it into a compromise. Nose down, maybe 30 degrees, tail up, falling in a long, shallow spiral. Enough of the stabilizers remained to impart some ugly stability. The land below was a far-off mosaic. Fields, roads, a river flashing like a scratched mirror. It was getting larger. Somewhere between the roar of the slipstream and the pounding in his chest, another sound pushed through, the throat-punching vibration of the tail guns when they fired. He still had electrical power. For now. Perhaps a battery in the tail. Perhaps wiring that happened to have been torn in just the right way. He could still move the turret. He could still shoot. Above him, behind him, in his sticking upward frame of reference, German fighters were still around. Some peeled off, deciding the falling tail was no longer worth the risk. Others came in for a quick pass, either out of habit or in hopes of silencing a gun that might still put a 50 into their radiator. Fear wanted to glue his hands to the armrests. Training overruled it. He swung the guns, leading not just the fighter's motion, but his own absurd one. Imagine trying to hit a bird with a rifle while you yourself are being dropped down a mine shaft. He thumbed the triggers. The Browning shuddered, the smell of burnt powder and hot oil thick in the tiny space. Tracers carved erratic lines up into the sky. One FDJ-190 lined up a cocky run, underestimating the tail's rate of fall. Moran's burst caught him by surprise. He saw his own tracers intersect the German's path. 3, 4 bright impacts along the port wing route. The 190 flinched. A tongue of flame spat from its cowling. It rolled away, smoke trailing. "Take that with you," Moran growled, voice muffled by mask. He had no idea if he'd killed the man. He had the satisfaction of knowing he'd at least ruined his day. Another fighter swung in, then broke off before committing. Whether put off by the still-firing guns or the sheer weirdness of attacking a free-falling tail, he couldn't tell. Time distorted. Seconds stretched and snapped. His brain tried to process too many inputs. Altimeter unwinding. Gunsmoke inside turret. The weird light cottage of the German countryside swelling below. The way his body alternately felt heavy and light as the tail section hit small eddies of air. His ammo counters ticked down. At some point, one of the guns jammed, the right gun's cycling mechanism choking on a deformed round. The left kept going. He compensated, adjusting aim for the changed recoil. The world narrowed to that gunsight ring, jerking against a backdrop of falling earth. In an odd, detached way, he realized he was no longer trying to save himself. There was no saving a man falling 4 miles without a parachute and a chunk of aluminum. He was simply doing his job until he couldn't. Keep firing at the enemy until the fight or your life ends. Below, the ground was no longer a smear. It was fields, then individual hedges, then the hint of trees. He had perhaps 10 seconds. He took his fingers off the triggers long enough to cross himself clumsily with one hand, jostled by the slipstream. Then he grabbed the turret frame, tensed every muscle, and waited for impact. Unteroffizier Karl Becker of a rural Luftwaffe Flak unit near Bremen didn't see the tail separate. From his 20 mm position, what he saw was the familiar, a crippled B-17 falling out of formation, smoke trailing, pieces shedding. He tracked it with his gun for a while, then shifted to fresher targets higher up. The big bombers still in tight box formation were more important than a dying outlier. It wasn't until later, when the batteries fell silent and the surviving fortresses were just dirty streaks on the horizon, that local farmers began pointing at something odd in a distant field. Becker and a few other Luftwaffe men rode out in a truck to investigate, engines rumbling over narrow dirt roads. In a shallow depression at the edge of a copse of trees, they found a hunk of airplane that made no immediate sense. The entire tail of a B-17 lay there, vertical fin canted at an angle, horizontal stabilizers twisted, skin buckled. The forward edge was a jagged ring where the fuselage had sheared. Smoke still rose from torn wiring. As they approached cautiously, carabiners at the ready, they saw a flicker of movement, a shape inside the tail cone. The tail gunner's position had been battered, plexiglass shattered, frame bent. Inside, half buried in a mess of ammo belts, mangled metal, and spent casings, a human form shifted feebly. A crewman in a bulky sheepskin jacket, helmet missing, face streaked with blood. One of the Germans swore softly. "He can't be alive," another muttered. He was. Badly broken, arm at an angle it shouldn't be, blood soaking one leg of his flight suit. But breathing, eyes half open, lips moving without sound. Becker saw spent 50 cal cases everywhere, piled around the remains of the tail guns like brass snowdrifts. He imagined for a second what it must have been like. This man dropping out of the sky in a severed tail, still crouched at his guns. Stay. Spraying lead into the air on the way down. "Verrückter Ami," one of his comrades said quietly. "Crazy American." There was no valor in finishing a half-dead man. They hauled him out as gently as circumstances allowed, laid him on a stretcher made from a door. One of the younger Germans stared at the arrow-straight barrels of the twin Brownings for a long time. Later, over thin soup in a mess hall, he would tell the story in halting terms. He fell with no parachute, and he'd say, just the tail of his machine, and they say he kept shooting the whole way. Like most combat stories, it would grow in the telling. By the time it reached a rear echelon, the falling tail gunner had shot down 2-3 German fighters on the way down. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between myth and paperwork. But the core was undeniable. A B-17 tail section had fallen nearly 4 miles. The kid inside had lived. And there was all the evidence in the world, in spent brass and scorched gun barrels, that he hadn't gone quietly. When Moran surfaced from the gray fog, the first thing he noticed was the pain. It was everywhere, sharp in his right leg, a deep, grinding ache in his back, a hot throb behind his left eye. The second thing was the language. Voices around him speaking German, not English. The harsh consonants and unfamiliar cadences made his heart skitter. He was in a small infirmary room, plaster walls, an iron bed, a thin, scratchy blanket drawn up to his chest. His right leg was in a rough splint, his left arm wrapped to his torso. A German doctor in a white coat, Wehrmacht collar tabs over the breast, stood at the foot of the bed reading a chart. A nurse adjusted a glass I-4 bottle. "You are awake," the doctor said in heavily accented English, noticing his eyes. "Guten Tag, Sergeant." Moran tried to speak. His throat felt like sandpaper. "You had sehr große luck," the doctor went on, groping for the words. "Very great luck. Tail. She fell in trees. Snow. Soft ground. Even so, many bones broken." Memories skidded back into place in fragments. The dive. The guns. The flash of a 190 twisting away, trailing smoke. The green blur of forest rushing up. "Did any of my crew?" he managed. The doctor's face changed. Just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes. "I am sorry," he said. "You're only one from that machine." It landed like a physical blow. They were gone. Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio man, waist gunners, ball turret gunner. The men whose voices had filled his headset hours earlier were now neat entries in some casualty list. He'd survived what no one had any right to survive. "I fell?" he asked, as if needing confirmation. The doctor nodded. "Ja, tail fell perhaps. 6 kilometer. Many villagers see. Very impressive." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There was a kind of macabre pride in it. Villagers had watched a piece of a B-17 fall from a clear sky, guns still poking out the back. Years later, when investigators traced the records and interviews, the story slotted uneasily into the file folder of incredible survivals, alongside RAF gunner Nicholas Alcamade, who had dropped from a burning Lancaster without a chute and lived after crashing through trees and snow. Moran became a prisoner of war. He was shunted through the familiar pipeline, Dulag Luft for interrogation, then on to a permanent camp. In Stalag barracks, huddled under lice-ridden blankets, he told his story to other downed airmen. At first, they looked at him with skepticism. "No chute?" one asked. "Come on, kid. You expect us to believe that?" He pointed to the scars, the half-healed fractures, the German medical report he'd managed to keep. They believed him. Then they told it their own way, around little stoves made from Red Cross tins. "Kid rode his tail down from 20,000 feet, they'd say. Kept blazing away at Jerry's all the while." The details blurred. The core stuck. After the war, when Moran finally came home, thinner, older in the eye than his years, he didn't brag. He went back to something like a normal life. But word filtered out, in 8th Air Force newsletters, in gunnery school scuttlebutt, in a line or two in an official history. The tail gunner who fell with his tail and kept firing. The Army Air Forces never turned fall without a parachute into doctrine. You couldn't train for that. What they did turn into training material quietly were the attitudes behind it. At post-war gunnery schools and reunion banquets, instructors and veteran gunners would sometimes mention Moran's story. Not as a dare to cheat death, but as a parable about doing your job even when the situation is hopeless. About understanding your position in the larger machine, knowing that as long as your guns are live, you are part of the bomber's defense, even if the rest of the airplane is literally gone. In the brief, weird moment of the Cold War, where B-36s and B-52s still carried human tail gunners, the legend had a particular resonance. One tail gunner in a training hangar might slap the barrel of his remotely controlled cannon and say, half joking, "If this bird ever goes to bits, I'm riding it like that guy over Bremen." Everyone knew who he meant, even if they didn't remember the name. A kid, 19, strapped into the loneliest position on a flying fortress 5 missions in, whose parachute had been chewed to rags by flak and bullets, who, when the tail came off and gravity took over, didn't curl up and wait. He grabbed the triggers and kept shooting. From a technical standpoint, the survival was a freak convergence. The way the tail fell, the trees and snow that cushioned the impact, the angle at which the metal crushed instead of slicing. From a human standpoint, what stuck was image, a falling tail cone, caged guns roaring into a sky full of swirling German fighters, spent brass raining into empty air. It's easy, looking back from a safe distance, to romanticize that stubbornness. In the moment, in that tiny plexiglass bubble over Bremen, it wasn't about legend. It was about a 19-year-old with no way out, clinging to the only sliver of control he had left, the triggers under his thumbs, and doing the job he'd been given until he physically couldn't anymore. The 8th Air Force lost hundreds of fortresses over Germany. Most went down with all hands, some with a handful of survivors in parachutes. A very few left behind stories that seemed to bend the laws of probability. Eugene Moran's fall belongs to the last category, a reminder that in the worst moments, some men don't think in terms of minutes left or feet to impact. They think in terms of, is the enemy still out there? Are my guns still working? Then I'm not done yet. In a war measured in kilotons and casualty figures, that mindset doesn't tilt the math much on its own. But for every German fighter pilot who broke off an attack under unexpected fire from a dead tail, for every second bought for a bomber to limp a few miles closer to home, it mattered. And decades later, when someone at an air museum stands under the tail of a restored B-17 and wonders aloud what it must have been like back there, there's one answer, half joking, half true. Ask the kid who rode his tail down from 4 miles up, guns blazing. Because sometimes the line between a statistic and a story is just one man refusing to stop shooting, even as the ground rushes up.